welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you're new around here, then my name is Katie. I'm a full-time sketchbook artist, and today I'm going to be sharing a review of these Tim Holtz Distress Crayons. So I've been using this set, which is set 10, for about 6 months now, and I've been testing them out in my sketchbook, and I've been getting quite a few questions about how to use them and what they're like. So I've also bought this second set recently, which is set 8, so I'm going to be swatching them all together. There are a lot more colours than this, but I don't want to buy colours that I'm not going to use. So for me, these two sets work great in terms of the colour palettes. As I said, I am going to swatch them because I do find with these, the colours on the lids are not very accurate to the colours that actually come out. So I think that's really important. And I definitely recommend looking up swatches of the sets beforehand. But there are a lot of colours in these ranges. I'll put how many there are on the screen, but there is definitely quite a wide selection, and I love the colour names. So also in this video I'm going to be comparing them with Neocolors, which is a question I get asked a lot, and Faber Castell Gelatos, which is why they're out on the desk. But first let's swatch these out and I can share a little bit more about how they feel and how we can use them. So these Distress Crayons are water soluble, so I'm going to start by putting down some swatches of them dry as they are, and then we'll add some water and I can show you how they look wet. So as I said, this is set 10. And they each have a colour. So this is called Aged Mahogany. So that's it dry, and I'm going to add some water. So as you can see here, they're very, very soft. So compared to the Neocolors, they won't keep their nib very long. You don't sharpen these because they're just way too soft. They're extremely malleable and squishable, I'd say. So you can kind of see that there's a thing on the end which you can twist to then turn it up. So there's quite a lot of pigment in here, not a huge amount. I haven't actually ever pushed it up so high, but it's not very weighty, it's quite light. I do find that these do last quite well though. But yes, you definitely can't get really fine lines, although you can use the tip to get some lines, but it does squish quite easily. So I've just dipped my paintbrush in water, and you can see it really lightens it up. I'm just swatching this on a Piss sketchbook, but you can really see the difference between the mahogany colour there and then the lightness when I've added the water. Next up we've got Wild Honey, which looks like this on the lid, and then it's a lot darker on the actual paper. So I do find that the lid can be quite misleading. You can see this was a lot warmer, it's a lot cooler here on the page, and then when I wet it, it turns it lighter again. Next is Tea Dye, which is this soft pink on the lid, but comes out much, much darker, so it almost looks like a brown when I swatch it on the page, and you can really see the stark difference here between the lid and the colour that's laid down. But let's see if water makes it a little bit lighter. So a little bit lighter, but certainly not as pink or as rosy toned as the lid. Next is Forest Moss, which looks like this dark green colour. I'd say this one's quite accurate to the lid. And then with water, it becomes a really nice dark green, but a lot lighter than you can see when it was first laid down. So these are obviously water soluble. This next one is called Iced Spruce, which is a really nice sort of muted turquoise. I would say this is a little bit more blue tone than the lid, but quite accurate. So they are water activated, but they do set. So if I was to come in a little bit later to try and reactivate these ones that I haven't added water to, it would be a lot harder. I'm also going to show how they blend together in a minute. It can take some time, and as I said in the beginning, I will be comparing these to the Neocolors and the Faber Castell Gelatos. Next up we've got this brown colour which is called Gathered Twigs. They have really nice names. I really like the names of these. I think they're really fun. Tim Holtz does have a whole load of things in this distress range, so not just these distress crayons, he also has ink pads, but for me I've only tested out these crayons. So again, that goes lighter, but it's a lot more similar to the Tea Dye up here in terms of the tone. So that one doesn't look brown at all on the lid, but it is definitely more brown than the pink the lid shows. So that is set 10, so I'm just going to write that down for reference. And next up we've got set 8. So again, these are the pastel ones. I'm going to see how they compare to the colour of the lids, but I'm excited to give these a go. These are the new ones I haven't tried yet. So we're starting with Tattered Rose, which is this soft pink. It'll be interesting to see how this compares to the Tea Dye. Okay, that's definitely a lot more accurate. It's more like a blush pink. You can see that the pigment does come off a little bit, but it's really soft to use. That's quite accurate to the lid. It's a little bit more pink toned. And then I'll wet it and it does lighten it up a little bit. Not as much as some of the darker tones. Next we've got Scattered Straw. Okay, that's quite different. I prefer this colour that's coming out, which is lucky, but it's definitely not the pale yellow. So the lid makes it look quite cool toned. It's a lot warmer. It's more like a honey shade. And then if I wet this, it does lighten it up. It brings a little bit more of that yellow tone out, but it certainly doesn't match the lid. It's quite similar to the Wild Honey above, but it's a lot lighter. Next up we've got Shabby Shatters, which is a really nice green. Oh, I really like that. That reminds me of the light olive Neocolor. You can see that the pigment is coming off a little bit more on these. I think that's because they're brand new and I haven't used them before. But they are smushable, so I'm going to do some tests with that in a moment. But for now we're just doing some swatches. I really like this one. I think that one will be used a lot along with the moss colour. Next is Weathered Wood. I'm not sure why this one's called Weathered Wood, considering it's not a brown. It's a cool sort of ice blue, but definitely a lot darker coming down than the lid. So here's a comparison. It's a lot lighter, which I know the water does make it lighter, but I don't think that the lids are very accurate at all. It's still not as light as the lid shows. Then we have Milled Lavender, which looks like quite a muted purple, but it's definitely not muted coming down on the page. That's interesting. This is probably the one where it's actually brighter than the lid, so you can see the difference there. It's a bit more pink toned on the lid than it is coming down on the paper, and then adding the water, which softens it again. And then last up for this set we have got this old paper, which again looks like quite a soft green. That's really nice. It's not as green as it shows. It's sort of like a green toned beige. Actually, it's quite accurate to the lid. It's not quite as vibrant. And then with the water. It's not as green as it looks. But I can also see that working quite nicely in pairing with some of these other shades. Let's just add on a label here. So as I said, there are a lot more sets that you can get. You can really see that these are my kind of colours. I really like using more muted tones and I draw a lot of nature and landscape. So I think these sets are perfect for me. There are definitely some missing colours for me if I wanted to build my collection. But because they come in multi-packs, then you're going to get some that you might not use with others. Obviously we're missing quite a lot of bright primary tones like the reds and the oranges. But as I said, I think these will work really nicely for my landscapes and nature work. So next up I want to show you how they blend both wet and dry. So let's try blending from Scattered Straw. And I'm going to do this starting with the wet. So I'm going to just put this one here. So this is the Gathered Twigs, which is the brown. I'm just going to bring them a little bit closer together. And let's start with the lighter colour and then blend them in together. Try and get some more pigment. Okay, so it does blend really nicely. This paper is sinking into the page quite a lot because it is quite thirsty paper, but that's quite nice. Let's see how it works with the dry blending. So I'm going to put down my dark as I did before, but I think I'll come back in with the lighter colour because otherwise I don't think it will blend as well. So I'll come in with the Scattered Straw. And that's quite nice. It does layer really nicely together. That's quite a nice gradient here. You can see the difference in colours though. It keeps the warmth here where I haven't used the water. Now I also want to do a little test with the smudging. So let's pick some other colours. Let's pick the purple. I'm just going to lay this down and then merge that into the blue. So this is Milled Lavender with Weathered Wood. So here's our blue. So as I said, they are a lot softer than Neocolors, so you can do this, which you wouldn't be able to do with Neocolors. So you can see the blue is obviously a lot more pigmented than the purple, but that's laid really nicely. Let's add some more purple here and a clean finger to smudge that over there. I really like that. That's a really nice effect. You could do this with Neocolors if they're especially soft, but it's a lot harder. I'm going to do some more comparisons with those in a minute. So I'm just going to lay down some little blobs of colour here because I want to compare how they smudge when you've just laid them down versus when they've been down a while. So let's come back to this one here that I'm putting down at the end of the video. And then this one I'm going to smudge immediately with my finger. Just a dry finger. I'm just going to smudge it so you can see just how soft that is, and the pigment smudges quite far. So let's come back to that one in a little bit. So the way I've been using these so far is for backgrounds and to create textures and build up layers in my work. So because I've been using them as backgrounds, I want to share how different mediums work over the top. So let's put down a few bits of colour here in various different shades, and then we can try pencils and Neocolors on top. So I'm also going to smudge these a little bit just to try and make them dry a little bit quicker on the page. Because they are so soft, they do feel like they are a little bit tacky on the page, so I can really feel the tackiness where it's still movable. I'm also going to do one where we're going to wet it so we can see how the other materials work on top of that as well. I'm doing a few different colours. Oh, you can see where that one still had a lot of the pigment from the brown. So it does pick up from the other colours. I want to do a lot of colours so we can see how dark and light work on top. It does create quite a thick pigment. It's almost like a paint because of how much pigment's going down on the page. So it's quite movable, but I do find that the more it's dried, the less movable it is. So if I was to put down a circle and then wait 5 minutes and then try to move it, the circle would still be apparent. Whereas with this one, you can really smudge out those initial marks. Okay, so let's test out how these work and layer on top of each other. So we're going to take a dark coloured, so this is gathered twigs on top of the old paper. So that works really nicely. It's probably not quite as dark as it would be. Oh, it's quite similar. I guess that shows quite nicely because it's dark on top of light. Let's grab a lighter colour, so scattered straw. It shows a little bit. It shows more than you would think, which is quite nice to see, so that's layering quite well. Now on top of this one, I'm going to use some pencils. So I'm going to grab a few different pencils. So I've just grabbed a few mid-tone pencils. We've got the Faber Castell Polychromos, Caran d'Ache Luminance, and then the Derwent Drawing. So I want to see how these layer on top of the Distress Crayons. So first up with the Polychromos. So that layers quite nicely. I am pressing quite hard, but it is showing up. Then we've got the Luminance. Again, that's layering quite nicely. It definitely layers better over here than it does the Neocolors. And lastly, the Derwent Drawing. So that works quite nicely. For the one underneath, I want to do some lighter tones, but so far I'm impressed with how they layer. Okay, so I've just grabbed some of those same branded pencils but in white. So we've got the Polychromos, and the Luminance is a pink white, so I don't have a pure white. I think it will work fine, and then the Chinese white, and I want to see how it layers on this darker shade. So starting with the Polychromos. This is obviously really difficult for pencils to go over, but it is struggling to show the white. It's kind of mixing in a little bit. It's making the nib really quite dirty. You can see the lead coming off there. So it's kind of just picking up on the nib. Let me show you a close-up. You can see here how it's getting quite dirty. Next up, let's see how the Luminance works. Again, pretty much the same. It feels like it's not really layering on top. It's just smudging the medium underneath. I'm going to try this on the wetted one as well, so it's not just picking up the pigment. Again, you can see how it's just picking it up on the lead. Now next up is the Derwent Drawing Chinese White, which is my favourite white. It's a little bit more pigmented than the others, but again, it's kind of just smushing that into a lighter green. So I feel like that's a handy test. I think because it is so movable still with the pigment underneath, I think it will be interesting to see how it layers on some of these drier ones, where I've used the paintbrush and it's sunk into the page. So let's use the colours we've already tested out. This is the blue. Now this paper isn't super thick and it doesn't hold wet media really well, but let's test the white. Okay, barely there on the white, you can't really see that at all, but these were the Polychromos. Then we have the Luminance. So that layers quite nicely. And the white doesn't do too bad. I think that's better than the Polychromos. I do have a video comparing these pencils just on their own on my YouTube. And then next up, the Derwent drawing. So that's really nice. And the white. Oh, so there was still a bit of pigment there, but that's layering much, much better than the other white. So you can see here, I guess it was a bit more pigmented. It's not super, super white, but definitely better than the Polychromos and the Luminance. Obviously it was a pink white, but this is my favourite white for a reason. It's really, really pigmented, and it does show up quite nicely on here. It definitely feels like it's layering better. It's not just pushing the pigment around, and that goes for all three pencils. So I'm not going to put paint on here because I'm pretty certain most paints will layer on really, really well. You would have to be careful if it's water soluble that it doesn't mix underneath. So if I was using gouache and making it really wet, it might pick up some of the colours, so it could dirty it. But I do want to try out these brush pens. So that layers quite nicely. This is a Tombow 553 and this is an Albrecht Dürer Ultramarine. So it layers really nicely. I find that with Neocolors it doesn't do that as well. Let me show you with a Neocolor underneath. So I don't have this colour in Neocolor, but I've got a similar sort of shade. This is the Apricot. So let's put that down. I'm going to add water to it like I did with the above. Actually, if it does have water on it, it might work better. But let's try it just as it is and see how it compares with the pencils. I'm also going to put down a dark shade so we can do a fair test. This is a dark olive Neocolor, and you can see it does smudge it a little bit. I get some pigment on my finger, but barely. So it really is not as soft. It's much, much harder than the Distress Crayons. Again, I do have a video all about Neocolors on my channel, but you can see here it's very, very pigmented. I'd say more pigmented than the Distress Crayons, but again, you've got that sort of painty effect where it's bringing it up and you can move it around and get rid of those initial marks as well. With Neocolors, they don't set like the Faber Castell Gelatos and these Distress Crayons do. So whilst that's drying, let's test out the pencils on these other ones. So this is the dry Neocolor. I'm pretty sure the midtones aren't really going to show, but let's give it a go. So there's the blue and the white with the Polychromos. Again, just like with the dry Distress Crayons, it's picking it up on the nib and just moving it about. Next we've got the Luminance. Okay, that's really, really not showing. It's really struggling to go over the Neocolor. And again, picking up the pigment. And here's the white, which is a little bit better, but again, it just feels like it's scraping it off, and it's scraping it off quite a lot. So it's much easier scraped off than the Distress Crayons, and that's because the pigment hasn't softened into the page, whereas it has for the Distress Crayons. And then lastly, this colour probably won't show much because it's not much different. It's actually a pretty good match. This is the Olive Earth in Derwent Drawing, and then the Chinese White, which again struggles. It is showing up, but that's because I'm basically scraping off the Neocolor. So I think that's a really interesting test. I'm also going to do the same test on this lighter Apricot. So you can see how it struggles because this pigment is quite thick. It does feel like crayon when it's going down, these Neocolors, but it doesn't sink into the page at all, and it's not as soft. So that was the Derwent Drawing. I've done it in a different order now. This is the Polychromos, which works quite well. But I tend to not ever use colour pencils over Neocolor because you can see it's a little bit more irregular. And then the blue Polychromos. So you can kind of see where the Neocolor's a lot thicker, it kind of skips it. And that's just because it doesn't really like going over the top of the Neocolor crayon where it's wax, even if it is water soluble wax. I didn't do the Luminance on this one, I've completely messed up there. Let's try that there. Okay, yeah. So again, it's similar. I think I did the Polychromos twice, but the nib is really just scratching off the Neocolor. This one over here is dry now, so let's test out those pencils again. We'll start in order this time and do the Polychromos first. So we've got the blue. Okay, it's not, if you see what colour this is on the plain page, you can see it definitely lightens it. And then we've got the white. Again, that's a little bit dirty. So, but it's not really showing at all. It's actually making it look a bit yellow. Then we've got the Luminance. It does layer on a bit better than the blue. Then onto the pink white from the Luminance. Tried to clean this nib off a little bit, but it's still a bit dirty, so that might come off. It just feels like it's indenting the page. It's not making much pigment at all on the top, So let's finish with the Derwent drawing. That's a little bit better. That's much better actually, I'd say. And then the Chinese white. So it works on some areas of this, but again, it's certainly not as pigmented as it is. You can see a little bit more than the others, but it's barely showing. So I would say that it's still got that sort of wax resist, even though it has been watered down. If you were to do a thinner layer of Neocolor, I think it would work better, but it depends on how you use your Neocolor 2s. I'm talking about the Neocolor 2s here. The Neocolor ones aren't water soluble. I did say I was going to do some brush pens on top, so let's do that quickly as well. Actually, it will be interesting to see if I pick the same colour. Wow, that's quite different. Obviously, it is a different colour underneath. And this one. So this one is super inky, and I think that helps. So it's not going to pick up the pigment. But if I was to smudge at this Neocolor, it is affecting the nib, whereas it doesn't pick it up on the Distress crayons because they've sort of set. Okay, so we've gathered that they are not like Neocolors in terms of their softness, but I think something that is more similar is the Gelatos. Now, I don't have a huge array of these Gelatos in terms of colours. I do have their bigger sets, so I'm going to swatch those, but I would say that they don't come in as many muted colours. They're a lot more vibrant. These have more primary tones. I really like the translucent set, but that's not available anymore. So in terms of the colour palettes, I prefer the Distress crayons. But one thing that I think is really important to mention is that the Distress crayons are not light fast, whereas the Faber Castell Gelatos are light fast, and I'm not sure on the Neocolors. I think they are. I'll put that on screen. But the Distress crayons are definitely not. They're more like a crafting item, so I think it's great for sketchbooks, but if you're going to do a commission, then you would absolutely need to seal it, because they are definitely not light fast. So let's put down some of these Faber Castell Gelatos. I'm going to try and use some more muted colours. This is quite similar to the Shabby Shutters. So if I put that down and then smudge it, it's not as soft, but it is definitely still smudgeable. And more smudgeable compared to the Neocolors. Let's do a test with the Distress crayon right underneath it. Very, very similar. It's a little bit more yellow toned. Okay, so you can see the pigment there. Actually, it is quite similar, but you can see how this one sinks into the page a little bit more because it's not quite as soft. So that's really interesting. I think that's helpful. These ones are definitely more smudgeable than the Faber Castell Gelatos. And then let's do it with water as well. So again, I'm just going to lay this on. And I'll pick the brown that we've got, which isn't quite as dark. This one is the Gathered Twigs. It looks dark when it goes down, but it's going to lighten when I add the water. I feel like these won't last as long as the Faber Castell Gelatos. Obviously, the pigment stick is a lot thinner. Let me give you a comparison. Here we go. So you can see that there's a lot more surface area on the Gelatos than with the Distress crayons. And these are softer, so I think they would wear down a little bit quicker. So it's had a little bit of time to sit, so let's see how it works with the water. That's picking up quite nicely. I'm able to get enough pigment up. But as I said, these do set and you can work on top of them, but you can't then reactivate them like you can with Neocolor 2s. And then the Distress crayon underneath. Oh, okay, that's not quite as light as I expected. That's good. It's a lot more of a warmer brown. The one above is cooler, but it's not gone as light as I thought it would. So I'm going to leave those to dry. And next I'm going to put down some swatches so we can see how things layer on top of the Gelatos, just like we did with the Neocolors. So this pink is one of my most used colours in the Gelatos. I can definitely be a bit more heavy-handed with these. I can push harder because they feel like they won't break or smush as much. Let's make that a bit bigger. And I'm going to put down the Tattered Rose as a comparison for the Distress crayon. You can see it's a bit more muted. I really like muted shades and I will use them a lot more. There's definitely colours in the Faber Castell Gelato sets that I don't use as much. And let's do that again, but smudge it a little bit more, just to see how it sits on top. So I'm going to pick this sort of ochre shade for the Gelatos and soften that in with my finger. definitely smudgier when it's just laid down. So compared to the green that we did, you can really see the difference there. If you want to smudge them, it's best to do it when they've just hit the paper. And then we've got the Wild Honey for the Distress Crayons. And again, I'm going to smudge this out straight away. So it's definitely not as warm toned, which is funny because I would say this lid matches the top one a lot better than the actual pigment in the barrel. Okay, so let's use those exact same pencils again to see how it layers on the gelatos. I know we've done it on the Distress Crayons already, but I think it's helpful to have that direct comparison. So above is the Faber Castell Gelatos. So I think it layers a lot better on top of these than it does with the Neocolors. And then we've got the white. And then below is the Distress Crayons. So not as pigmented on the Distress Crayons. Again, especially with the white, it's not really doing anything, and that's because this feels more tacky than the Faber Castell Gelatos. I would say the Neocolors don't feel tacky at all, whereas the Gelatos and the Distress Crayons do, but the Distress Crayons definitely a lot more. And we've got the Luminance. Again, it's just sort of picking that up there, and underneath, similar. And then the white. Doesn't even make a difference on the Distress Crayons. And then we're going to end with the Derwent drawing. So I should have done a bigger swatch. We've got the green. That works better. So the darker colours definitely work better. And then the white. Yeah, not really showing at all. It works better on the Gelatos, but not much. Let's do those tests on these ones which have been smudged out. And then we'll do them on the watered down ones as well. So Polychromos. That works quite nicely on both of them, and the white. Much better on the Gelatos, showing up there than it is at all on this one. It's kind of just making a smudgy brown on the Distress Crayons. Then we've got the Luminance, works quite nicely, and the white. That's not too bad. I'd say it's more white on the top one than it is the bottom. And then the Derwent drawing. So interestingly, it works better on the smudged out Distress Crayon than it does the smudged out Gelato for the Derwent drawing. Let's see the white. Pretty good. Not as white on the bottom one. Again, it is mixing in with that pigment where it's not quite settled in, where it's so soft, and making this sort of greyish colour again. Okay, so these are the ones that I've watered down with a paintbrush. I'm going to do the exact same thing. So the paper is holding, but I can feel it's getting a little bit weak. So this is the Polychromos, top is the Faber Castell Gelatos, and bottom is the Distress Crayons. So there's the blue and the white. The white really doesn't do much there on the top one. A little bit on the bottom, but not much. Then we've got the Luminance. That's showing, I'd say that feels a little bit better on the bottom one. And then the pink white. That's worked quite nicely. And there too. So that's interesting. Definitely the white works better when it's watered down underneath. I think that's also because it's not picking up the pigment, because it's settled into the page. And then lastly, the Derwent drawing. So green layers nicely. Oh, that's really nice on top, and that one. So the white, it's a little bit more white on the top one, but you can really see the difference there when it has been wetted into the page compared to these ones down here where they were just smudged, where it is still just picking up the pigment. The drier watered down ones definitely work the best. So before I share my final thoughts, I'm just going to come back to this blob that we did earlier so you can see how easy it was to smudge. It's still smudgeable, but you can see how different that is from when we first laid it down. So I'm not making the lighter colour. I can work it and sort of soften it with my hands, especially with the heat, but you can really see the difference of waiting a minute before we activate it to doing it straight away. Okay, there we go. I hope that's been helpful to see how they compare to some other art supplies which you may already own versus these ones by Tim Holtz. To summarise, I would say the most important factors are that these aren't light fast, so that might be a factor in the art that you create, but I also really like how soft and smudgeable they are. For me, that means that they're more likely to be used for backgrounds, whereas for the Neocolors, I generally use that for details and final marks of colour. I would use these quite similar to the Gelatos because I also use them for backgrounds, but if I want a softer effect, then I would blend with the Distress Crayons rather than the Gelatos. They are both water soluble, and as we've seen, I think things layer better when they have been activated with the water. Both of them are similar in terms of being able to be set, so they won't be reactivated once they have completely dried, but the Distress Crayons definitely take longer to dry than the Gelatos. They're also very different to the Neocolors in terms of their softness. The Gelatos and the Distress Crayons are definitely a lot softer, with the Distress Crayons being the softest of them all. So I really like these colours. I think the colours are definitely the strongest point about these Distress Crayons. I really like these muted shades. As I said, I do think it's really important to look at swatches beforehand because, as we've seen, some of the lids are not very accurate to the colours that come out. But as a colour palette overall, I think these will definitely get a lot of use from me, and I'm really happy with how they work, especially with my nature work. So I hope you found this video helpful. Let me know if you want me to do any other tests or if you've got any other questions. But thank you so much for watching. A big thank you to my patrons for their support in allowing me to buy these art supplies and test them out here on YouTube in these free videos. And I hope you have a great week ahead. I will see you next Sunday in a new YouTube video. See you later!